Across many cultures and civilizations, there appears to be something of a fascination with giants. Even today, there is a belief that our very world was once inhabited by a race of towering monsters, with supposed archaeological dig sites uncovering bones of men and women that are far too big to belong to that of a conventional human. These giant skeletons were reported frequently in the early 20th century, though have since been discredited as hoaxes, fabrications, or the misidentification of extinct megafauna. One such claim was that there was an ancient white race known as the Mound Builders, made semi-famous by 18th century polemist Josiah Priest, that believed a lost giant tribe of Israel had settled in America before the natives and created mounds. Aleś Herczliczka, the curator of anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution in the 1930s, adamantly opposed this idea, which in turn led to a belief amongst believers that the Smithsonian Institution were destroying the bones of these giants so as to cover up their existence. Modern society wasn't alone in their belief that giants once roamed the earth, however. Just as some today believe the earth was inhabited by such creatures, so too did the Greeks. Edith Hamilton tells us in her work Mythology, they did not, however, think of them as huge lizards and mammoths, but as somewhat like men and yet unhuman. They had the shattering, overwhelming strength of earthquake and hurricane and volcano. In the tales about them, they do not seem really alive, but rather to belong to a world where as yet there was no life, only tremendous movements of irresistible forces, lifting up the mountains and scooping out the seas. The Norsemen also believed in a prehistoric race of thundering, powerful creatures, but framed them as malevolent beings who stood in direct opposition to the conversely benevolent gods. Author Helen Gerber, in her work Tales of Norse Mythology, tells us the northern races imagined that the giants were the first creatures who came to life among the icebergs which filled the vast abyss. These giants were from the very beginning the opponents and rivals of the gods, and as the latter were the personifications of all that is good and lovely, the former were representations of all that was ugly and evil. With such beliefs existing in a time before the authorship of the traditional Bible, it would make some sense that some of this essence of the old world would trickle into its pages. After all, giants are not beings that hide themselves away in the biblical narrative, but rather appear unapologetically in the likes of Goliath, a Philistine warrior who knows he towers over everyone else and doesn't mind showcasing it over them either. Giants are even believed to emerge as early as Genesis 6, believed in some interpretations to be the Nephilim, monstrous sons of the illicit marriages between angels and mortal women. Whether the giants in the Bible pertain to the likes of Goliath, who in some beliefs is a giant in the sense that he's an exceptionally large human, or whether the giants pertain to the likes of the Nephilim, who were, in most circles, bloodthirsty monsters, certain believers will be under the impression that giants, whether human or not, did exist in ancient times. Therefore, in today's episode, we'll be looking at cataloguing every giant mentioned in the Bible, in the hopes of further understanding who these creatures were, what they did that made them so notorious, and how different they really were from us. The Amorites appear as early as chapter 10 of Genesis, where they are named as one of the many descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham. Whilst we are not told here that these were a giant people, nor given any significant details about these people, we do know that these were one of the many groups who would come to settle in the great expanse of Canaan. Genesis 14 further confirms that the Amorites will be one of a number of people who will eventually fall to Abram's descendants, the Israelites, and who will cede their land to them. This is later reiterated to Moses in Exodus 23, where God tells him that, "My angel will go ahead of you, and bring you into the land of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and I will wipe them out. Based on mentions like these, the Amorites don't sound any different from any of the other groups living in Canaan. You would have no reason to believe that these were anything but ordinary people, whose only misgivings were that they weren't worshipping Yahweh, but instead worshipping their own gods. It isn't until we get to the minor prophets, specifically Amos, do we get an inkling that there was more to the Amorites than meets the eye. We are told in a monologue by God, "Yet I destroyed the Amorites before them, though they were tall as the cedars and strong as the oaks. I destroyed their fruit above and their roots below." The imagery presented to us here is very clear. The Amorites were not just a regular people, but rather a powerful people who were built far more imposingly than perhaps the conquering Israelites were themselves. Some might argue that the fact that God recognizes and addresses them as such is as good as any endorsement that these were large and mighty people. The comparison to the oak trees is also highly suggestive of this, especially if we were to take this literally. The 19th century Nave's Topical Bible by Methodist Orville James Nave appears to do just that, referring to the Amorites specifically as giants, even though the traditional Bible isn't as clear-cut. Now, you'd think that given this larger-than-life description in Amos, the Israelites would have had their work cut out for them when it came to dealing with these people during the Israeli expansion. God appears to foreshadow this in Genesis 15, where he tells Abraham that whilst his descendants will be many and great, they won't actually conquer the Amorites until as late as the 4th generation, because it is only then when the Amorite sin will be at its highest, and only then when they most deserve it. Yet when this time comes in Numbers 21, the Israelites don't seem to struggle all that much in the conflict with the Amorites, and if there were giants on the field, Numbers makes no indication that there were, then the Israelites have no difficulty in slaying them. We are told that Sihon, the king of the Amorites, actually marched his entire army out to meet Israel in the wilderness, and despite being more rested than the Israelites, who'd been marching through the wilderness for a while now, they are still defeated. We are told quite simply, when Sihon, king of the Amorites, reached Jahaz, he fought with Israel. Israel, however, put him to the sword and took over his land. Israel captured all the cities of the Amorites and occupied them. Sihon isn't the only Amorite king to be crushed by the Israelites, however. In Deuteronomy, we are told that the Israelites made their way towards the city of Bashan, where the king of the city, Og, marched out to meet them and try his luck. We are told, "So the Lord our God also gave into our hands Og, king of Bashan, and all his army. We struck them down, leaving no survivors. At that time, we took all his cities. There was not one of the 60 cities that we did not take from them. The whole region of Argob, Og's kingdom in Bashan. All these cities were fortified with high walls, and with gates and bars, and there were also a great many unwalled villages. We completely destroyed them, as we had done with Sihon, king of Heshbon, destroying every city, men, women, and children." Read standalone, there is again no indication that the Amorites were giants, and without the description in Amos 2:9, you'd be forgiven for assuming that the Amorites were just normal people, who were simply no match for the Israelites who were backed by their God. If the interpretation of the Nave Topical Bible is to be believed, and the Amorites really were giants, then they were either ineffective and quite docile to have been conquered so undisputedly by the Israelites, or perhaps were handicapped by God, who had promised the victory to the Israelites. In any case, it's far simpler, in my opinion, if you were to ignore the Nave Topical Bible as a misinterpretation, and read the description of Amos 2:9 as a mere hyperbole, possibly a description owed to a specific group of Amorites who happened to be taller than the rest. That being said, having come across Og, the king of Bashan here, it does lead us quite neatly into the next race of biblical giants, the Rephaites or Rephaim. Deuteronomy tells us, Og, king of Bashan, was the last of the Rephaites. His bed was decorated with iron, and was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. It is still in Rabbah of the Ammonites. The term Rephait or Rephaim is used to describe yet another people who ultimately fell to the Israelite takeover of the Promised Land. But beyond this, the Bible itself isn't that keen on describing exactly who these people were. If we were to make an inference based on the description of Deuteronomy 3:11, then it might well be assumed that if Og's bed was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, and Og was the last of his kind, then the broader group of Rephaites were indeed perhaps giants. For reference, a cubit was about 18 inches, thus making Og's bed at least 13 feet long. Now, this doesn't necessarily confirm that he filled the entire frame of his bed. Perhaps he just really liked having a super long bed. But the general belief is that Og was taller than your average person, and did belong to a people who were proportionately large, perhaps even giant by even today's standards. Interestingly, if you were to consult the Septuagint, the term Rephait in Joshua 12:4 and 13:12, which also describes Og as the last of the Rephaim, is translated outrightly as giant, leaving no room for discrepancy amongst its readers. Some determine that the Rephaim described here were likely descendants of the giant named Rapha, who is actually mentioned in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. It might be concluded from this then that as Og was the last of the Rephaim, he was more specifically perhaps the last of the true-blooded Rephaim, whereas the descendants of Rapha mentioned thereafter were born years later through mixed heritage. This would then dilute their giant attributes, making them not so gigantic as 9 cubits, but still big enough to have made an impression on the battlefield. The character Ishbi-Benob, a Philistine warring with Israel, who promises to kill David, is described as being a descendant of Rapha, who wields a bronze spearhead weighing 300 shekels, perhaps a slightly less impressive weapon than that of his fellow Raphite Goliath, who wielded a spearhead that was double that weight. In any case, the weight of such a weapon, which would have been around 3.5 kilos, wouldn't have been exactly immovable for any regular man. Could this then be a sign that this wasn't a giant, or at least a full giant, but rather a lesser version, whose genetic advantages had been watered down over Rapha's subsequent generations? This might very well be exemplified by how easily Abishai, David's nephew, proceeds to strike Ishbi-Benob down and kill him. That being said, the Israelites here tell David that he is never allowed to go out with them in battle again, for fear that he will perish, and the lamp of Israel would be extinguished. So this suggests that perhaps Ishbi-Benob was formidable, and did leave enough of a mark on David and his warriors to have put this kind of caution in place. Subsequently, in 2 Samuel 21, we are introduced to even more descendants of Rapha, a warrior named Saph, Goliath's brother named as Lami in Chronicles, and an unnamed Philistine who is described as huge, with 12 fingers and 12 toes. Despite their menacing appearances and reputations, each one of them is still slain by one of David's men. This then has the effect of showing readers that it doesn't matter how strong or powerful one appears to be, for if they are not living in accordance with God's laws and proceed to subvert his expectations, then they too will be felled. Deuteronomy appears to shed some light on the Rephaim, telling us that they were once referred to as Emites by the Moabite tribes, and Zamzumites by the Ammonites. Furthermore, they were recognized as a strong people, numerous in number, and as tall as the Anakites, another set of people we'll be discussing later in this episode. In any case, in spite of these Rephaim supposedly being giants, Deuteronomy concludes that they were still destroyed by the Lord and driven out of their places. Another idea suggests that Og was the last Rephaim to be born, hence him being the last of them, but that there were still other Rephaim living in the land, such as these descendants of Rapha. Having discussed the Amorites and the Rephaim, aka the Emites according to Moab or the Zamzumites according to the Ammonites, you might be interested to know that in Genesis 14, we are told of a king Kedorlaomer, who in a large-scale war defeats the Rephaim in Ashtoreth Karnim, the Zuzim, likely the Zamzumites in Ham, the Emin, possibly the Emites in Shaveh Kiriathim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir, in addition to defeating the Amalekites and the Amorites. Essentially, what we see here, if we are to believe that the Rephaim are giants, is a king who battles several of their tribes at once and comes out victorious. Perhaps the most controversial of the giants in the Bible are the Nephilim. Not only do you need to consult the apocalyptic Book of Enoch, and perhaps to a lesser extent, the apocryphal Book of Giants in order to get the full picture, but there exist some prominent interpretations that either relegate them as misinformation on behalf of some spies of Israel, or promote them as living, breathing monsters that somehow survived the days of the flood. Many will point to Genesis 6:1-4 as the first mention of Nephilim in the Bible, where we are told that when humans began to increase in number on the earth, the sons of God, presumed to be angels, saw the daughters of humans and came down from the heavens to marry them. Here we are famously told, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Some would argue that the phrasing used here in the Bible is somewhat vague, which is why I mentioned that readers might turn to the Book of Enoch to receive a much more detailed and elaborate picture of what is believed to have transpired here. The Bible doesn't actually describe the Nephilim here in question as giants, but merely that they were on the earth in those days, perhaps as a product of the illicit union between woman and angel. Nothing more is told to us of these Nephilim here in this passage, or in any other passage in the Bible for that matter. It is from the Book of Enoch where we learn that these Nephilim are the giant monstrous offspring of the women, and that after being born, proceed to unleash carnage on the earth. Additionally, it might also interest you to learn that whilst the Hebrew Bible does not describe these mighty men, or men of renown, as giants, the Septuagint has no problem doing so, and even link these with the same Nephilim seen much later in Numbers 13. In this instance, we learn that when Moses and the Israelites reach the desert of Canaan, they begin to scout and investigate the vast landscape to learn who lives here. When they return and report what they have seen, Caleb suggests that they should attack these people, for they surely would be strong enough to conquer them. However, some of these scouts objected to this, saying, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anakim come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them." Now, whether the descendants of the Nephilim were actually in the land of Canaan has been up for much debate amongst scholars. On the one hand, the Israelite spies may have been merely exaggerating their claims so as to dissuade others from taking Caleb seriously, and to prevent there from being any conflict. On the other hand, they actually did see the Nephilim there, and this was a real warning that they'd do well to stay well the hell away. The use of the word bad in bad report naturally makes it seem like the former. Some would say this report wasn't to be trusted, for it was fraudulent and disingenuous. Others, however, suggest that this wouldn't have been an exaggeration, nor a fraudulent report, because if we refer back to Genesis 6:4, the Nephilim were said to have been on the earth in those days and also afterward, perhaps referring to this moment in Numbers. If you were to consult the book of Enoch, and even some interpretations of Genesis 6, one prominent idea is that God sends the flood to wipe out not only the sinful humans, but also the violent Nephilim, who had by this point caused so much devastation that the world pretty much needed to be restarted anyway. A new human race is begun through Noah, whose bloodline was not tainted by that of the sons of God, and could be traced all the way back to Adam himself. This would then ensure that the monstrous Nephilim here could not manifest in this new world, at least not physically. Yet in spite of this effort, the Nephilim do show up again here in Numbers 13, which is yet another reason why some deduce that the scouts' report is not credible, for there is no way these creatures could have survived the flood. Conversely, there are those who would argue against even this, suggesting that Moses would later confirm the report in Deuteronomy, where he says, "Hear Israel, you are now about to cross the Jordan, to go in and dispose nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky. The people are strong and tall, Anakites. You know about them and have heard it said, who can stand up against the Anakites? But be assured today that the Lord your God is the one who goes across ahead of you like a devouring fire." As we saw in the account of Numbers, the Nephilim are described as the descendants of Anak, thus technically making them part Anakite or Anakim themselves. But who are these Anakim? We are led to believe from Joshua 15:14 and Judges 1:20 that the Anakim, or the Anakites, were descendants of a man named Anak, whom we are told had 3 sons in Shishai, Ahiman, and Talmai. Beyond this, one might refer back to Deuteronomy 2:11, where we previously discussed the Anakites being equivalent to the Rephaims, but that the Moabites called them Emites. We are told, like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephaims, but the Moabites called them Emites. Aside from this, the Bible doesn't have all that much to say about these particular people. Indeed, we know they were tall. We know they had a reputation. We know that at the very least, the Israelite spies had a reason to express doubt over facing them in battle. Evidently, they were a force to be reckoned with, which goes without saying if we are to believe that their lineage somehow continued to operate in spite of the flood. Yet for all this intrigue and consideration, it might come as some disappointment to learn that much like all the other giants we've discussed so far, they too are defeated by the Israelites, namely under the leadership of Joshua, and are said to be so utterly decimated that they don't even have that much territory left. We are told, at that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. An interesting note from 1 Samuel, as well as a convenient segue into our next giant, is that Goliath, perhaps the most notorious giant in the Bible, was born in Gath. We are told a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. With this in mind, there are efforts to connect Goliath with these descendants of Anak, for if Gad was one of the only places where the Anakites survived, then chances are Goliath was one of them. Goliath's emergence in the valley before the Israelites can be seen as quite imposing. He certainly puts fear into the Israelites by his mere presence alone. We are told, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath's height has become the subject of debate in recent years, with efforts to contest whether or not he can really be called a giant. One recent interpretation is much more conservative, suggesting that Goliath was only 6'6", which would have made him very tall back in biblical times, but not that much taller than some of the tallest men today. The Masoretic texts, however, describe him as being 6 cubits and a span, or 9'9", making him not only a monster of a man back then, but equally shocking today. The fact that the Bible takes its moment to describe Goliath's armor as being a coat of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels, with a javelin strapped to his back, certainly adds to the notion that this was no normal man. What's more, we've discussed that the Israelites were trembling at just the sight of him, but when they hear him speak and hear what he proposes, they are left positively petrified. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." Upon hearing this, the Israelites and Saul, who was leading them, are described as being dismayed and terrified, with none of them feeling all that courageous in the face of such a challenge. The only person who is seen to express absolutely no fear of Goliath is David, who at the time was a mere shepherd boy, presenting himself before Saul as the only candidate willing to fight Goliath, and thus the only one eligible. We are told of the battle, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. In this, you might say Goliath's death sets the trend of the remaining Philistine giants, who are shown to be slain in blink and you'll miss it moments later in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. One might say that the ease of which these giants are killed are not to dampen or reduce the potency of their power, for these were men of considerable size and strength, but rather to emphasize the efficacy of trusting in God, as well as in God's power. For the message seems to convey that if one acts with God on their side, any opposition, regardless of its advantage, can be quite seamlessly overcome. A much lesser known account of a giant appears in chapter 11 of 1 Chronicles. Though considering the Bible doesn't refer to him as a giant per se, it might be why he often flies under the radar. In this chapter, the mighty warriors of David are described in some detail, and we are told of some of their exploits, which helps shape their characters. One warrior in particular, the son of Jehoiada, Benaiah, is of particular interest. We are told, "And he struck down an Egyptian who was 5 cubits tall. Although the Egyptian had a spear, like a weaver's rod, in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear." Standing at 5 cubits tall, this unnamed warrior isn't quite as tall as Goliath, but he's probably still one of the tallest characters that is explicitly described in the biblical text. Yet nowhere is he associated with the Rephaim, or spoken of as a descendant of Anakim. Standing at what would be 7'6", this man would be a towering figure even by today's standards. Yet the Bible does not afford him with the same awe or accolade. Various translations of the Bible do make comment about his height, however. The King James Version, for example, describes him as having a great stature, making it known that his height was no trivial thing. In the parallel account of this event that's given to us in 2 Samuel 23:31, the New International Version of the Bible describes the Egyptian as huge, and he struck down a huge Egyptian. Although the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. If you were to consult the New King James Version, meanwhile, he is described as a spectacular man, whilst the New American Standard Version refers to him as impressive. Evidently, he warranted some form of complimentary adjectives, a rarity when describing the enemies of Israel, but he still falls short of being explicitly acknowledged as a giant. One idea is that despite his gargantuan size at 5 cubits tall, or 7 feet, in order to qualify as a giant in the eyes of the authors of these texts, you had to at least be 6 cubits, or 9 feet, just as Goliath was. Otherwise, you were effectively just a really tall person. Following on from the works of 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, giants pretty much fade out of scripture and don't seem to make any noteworthy return. One might speculate that either the Israelites had killed them all off, which, given their expansion across the desert, is more than likely, or that they stopped reproducing and naturally expired. As the biblical God never specifically speaks of giants, readers of the Bible would likely agree that they weren't in his plan, and so if they did exist, they most certainly do not now, hence their absence in the New Testament. There are a plethora of biblical and extra-biblical characters that have been described as giants in various texts. These include ideas that Nimrod, or even Gilgamesh, were conflated with the unnamed 6-figure giant that's seen to be slain in 2 Samuel. But as I wasn't able to find any legitimate sources to back this up, I didn't include it in this episode. There's also the likes of Oya and Haya, the giant siblings born to the watcher Sumyaza in the Book of Giants. But as these are from apocryphal works, I chose to omit these ones as well. But if I've missed any giants, or if there's any you'd like me to cover in the future, then let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you've enjoyed this episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.